In ancient China, the frequency of people eating meat was a rather complicated topic. Many people might imagine that the life of the ancients was like today's YouTube eating shows, drinking wine in large bowls and eating meat in large chunks, being carefree and happy. But in fact, it was far from being as easy for the ancients to eat meat as it is for modern people. There were many nuances, and the frequency of meat eating varied greatly among different classes, different periods, and different regions. First of all, in ancient times, meat eating was stratified. In the upper echelons of ancient society, those who held high positions and received generous salaries had more opportunities to eat meat. There were strict hierarchical systems in ancient times, and different identities meant great differences in the types and frequencies of meat that could be eaten. For ordinary people, eating meat without a proper reason was against the regulations and might even violate the law. This was because in the agricultural society, horses and oxen were extremely important means of production. If they were slaughtered casually, then the cultivation of farmland, the construction of water conservancy projects, etc., would face a shortage of labor. So in general, it was strictly prohibited to slaughter horses and oxen privately. Sheep had a special significance in the eyes of the ancients. The ancients admired the kneeling milk-giving of sheep and ranked them with horses and oxen as the more noble top 3 grade livestock. Chickens, dogs, and pigs were relatively less important for production, belonging to the lower 3 grade, and the status of those who ate them was also relatively lower. Starting from the pre-Qin period around 2000 BC, most ordinary people mainly had coarse grains and vegetables as their staple foods, and they had very few opportunities to eat meat. During the Warring States period, starting around 475 BC, the diet standard of common people was extremely low. Most people's daily food was bean rice and vegetable soup, and it was almost a luxury to have a taste of meat. At that time, there was a saying that people could be eligible to eat meat only when they reached the age of 70, which was enough to show how scarce meat was in the lives of common people at that time. During the Qin Han period, starting from 221 BC, although this was a unified dynasty and the economy had developed to a certain extent, it was still not easy for common people to eat meat. According to records, at that time, the diet of ordinary families was still mainly coarse food and vegetable soup, and only during festivals or special celebrations was it possible to cut a little meat to improve the diet. During the Tang dynasty from 680 to 907 AD, although the society was prosperous, the frequency of common people eating meat did not increase significantly. Despite having the Zhenguan reign, 627 to 649 AD, and the Kaiyuan prosperity, 713 to 741 AD, farmers' lives were still difficult, and they often faced the plight of hunger. On the one hand, the breeding cost of livestock such as cattle and sheep was high, and the price was expensive, which was unaffordable for ordinary people. On the other hand, although pork was relatively cheap, it was not favored by the scholar official class at that time. They thought pigs were dirty, and the amount of pork supplied in the market was not large. So, ordinary people still mainly ate vegetarian food, and occasionally eating an egg laid by their own chickens was considered an improvement in life. The situation changed slightly during the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644 AD. After around 1500, in the late Ming dynasty, with the growth of the population and the progress of agricultural technology, the scale of pig breeding gradually expanded, and the price became more affordable, gradually making its way onto the tables of ordinary people. In the book, The Plum in the Golden Vase, there are many descriptions of common people in the market eating pork, such as roasted pig heads, stewed pig trotters, etc., with various cooking methods. However, for the vast number of rural people, eating meat was still a rare thing. Throughout the year, they could only have a few bites of pork during the Chinese New Year or weddings and funerals. During the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1911 AD, when the Manchus entered the Central Plains, eating habits also changed to some extent. The Manchus liked eating pork very much. For example, the way of cooking boiled pork in plain water was to boil a large piece of pork until it was cooked, then cut it into thin slices and dip it in seasonings. This way of eating was popular among the court and Manchu nobles, and also influenced the folk cuisine in the Central Plains to a certain extent. But generally speaking, ordinary people still mainly had simple meals, and only during a bumper harvest year would they be willing to buy some meat to celebrate. In addition to class and time factors, regional factors also had an important impact on the frequency of the ancients eating meat. In the northern grassland areas, there were nomadic peoples who lived by herding, and they had relatively more opportunities to eat beef and mutton. In the Central Plains area, people mainly engaged in farming, and most of the common people depended on the output of the land for their livelihood. In places close to rivers and lakes, it was relatively convenient to eat fish, but in inland areas, the source of meat mainly relied on livestock breeding. Due to the high cost and limited output, there were few opportunities to eat meat. In some mountainous areas in the south, common people would obtain some wild game through hunting, such as wild rabbits and pheasants, but this was also restricted by factors such as seasons and government bans, and could not be a stable source of meat. To sum up, the frequency of the ancients eating meat was restricted by many factors such as class, time, region, economy, and culture. In ancient society, noblemen and high-ranking officials could enjoy all kinds of delicacies, while ordinary people often longed for a bite of meat, which exactly reflected the huge gap between the rich and the poor, just as the saying goes, "The mansions stink of wine and meat, while on the roads lie the frozen bodies." In terms of class factors, this difference was very obvious. People in the upper class, who had wealth and status, naturally had more choices in diet. They could obtain various kinds of meat according to their preferences and needs. For the lower class common people, they were not only restricted by laws and etiquette systems, but also by economic conditions. Their income mainly came from agricultural production, and the income from agricultural production could often only maintain basic living needs, and it was very difficult to have extra money to buy meat. From the perspective of the development of the times, although overall, the situation of people eating meat had improved to some extent over time, this improvement was very slow. In the pre-Qin period around 2000 BC, due to the extremely low level of productivity, people's food sources were very limited, and it was almost impossible for common people to eat meat. During the Qin Han period, starting from 221 BC, the establishment of a unified dynasty provided a certain foundation for economic development, but it still could not change the difficult situation of common people eating meat. During the Tang dynasty, from 618 to 907 AD, although the society was prosperous, it did not fundamentally change the dietary structure of common people. The changes during the Ming dynasty from 1368 to 1644 AD and the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1911 AD also occurred under the combined action of multiple factors. The influence of regional factors on the frequency of meat eating cannot be ignored. For the nomadic peoples in the northern grassland areas, their way of life determined that they had relatively rich sources of meat. Cattle and sheep were the main objects of their herding and an important part of their diet. In the Central Plains area with an agricultural civilization, people's food relied more on the crops produced by the land, and meat became a relatively scarce food. Even within the Central Plains area, there were differences in the opportunities to eat meat between places close to water sources and inland areas. Although the common people in the southern mountainous areas had the way of obtaining wild game through hunting, this was also full of uncertainties. In the economic structure of ancient times, agriculture was the leading industry. This economic structure greatly restricted meat production. Livestock breeding required certain resources such as sites and feed, and these resources were not very abundant in ancient times. For ordinary people, it was very difficult for them to have enough resources to breed livestock on a large scale. Moreover, in ancient times, transportation was inconvenient, and the transportation and preservation of meat were also big problems. As a result, in many places, the supply of meat was very limited. Cultural factors also influenced the frequency of the ancients eating meat to a certain extent. For example, during the Tang dynasty from 618 to 907 AD, the prejudice of the scholar official class against pork affected the supply of pork in the market and the acceptance of pork by the common people. The formation of this cultural concept was related to social customs, religious beliefs, etc. at that time. Similarly, the influence of the Manchu eating habits on the Central Plains during the Qing dynasty from 1644 to 1911 AD was also a manifestation of cultural dissemination. In general, the frequency of the ancients eating meat was the result of the combined action of multiple factors. This result reflects various aspects of ancient society, such as class differentiation, economic development level, regional differences, and cultural characteristics. Through the study of the frequency of the ancients eating meat, we can better understand the living conditions and social structure of ancient society.